Exciting, challenging discussion. That's what God Encounters is all about. Meeting God, encountering God wherever we're at. And so, I don't know exactly where you're at in your experience, but I know that for me, being a God follower hasn't always matched up with the church's picture. And so I invited a couple young guys up here who also have experienced some of those same discoveries, that the church has a picture, the world has a picture, God has a picture, and they aren't always the same picture. And sometimes all three have a different picture. And how do we as God followers dive into following God in a world that doesn't like Him, and sometimes, dare we say, a church that doesn't exactly like God either? And so here we are as young adults, and we are challenged with being followers of God, and we're also challenged to, shall we say, change the culture we live in, both the church culture, and as tonight we're going to discuss the pop culture of society. Now, if you're wanting a little bit bigger or better definition of what I'm describing here and what we're going to work with tonight, we're talking the music industry, the movie industry, and all the sub-industries that survive and exist because of it. And so tonight, we've got two components to our discussion. First, I'm going to ask these two young guys some questions, their experiences both in the church, outside the church, within the pop culture of today. And then we're going to have a Bible component at the end where we're going to look at a passage of Scripture that deals with this same exact issue, when the church doesn't seem to necessarily completely follow God's plan. And how do we deal with that? So I think it's safe for us to say that we've all experienced where the church has been a wonderful institution for us, where we've seen great things from it, but also experiences where the church hasn't exactly matched up to what we thought it would be or what we saw God was calling it to be. And so we're going to touch on that a little bit tonight. In a moment, both these young men are going to introduce themselves and share just a couple moments of where they are, where their experiences have been, and then we're going to move into some harder questions. So, well, let's start with Terrell here. You just arrived just a few moments ago, in fact.
I did. I just got here from Atlanta, Georgia. Oh, yeah. My name is Terrell King. I'm a singer, a songwriter. I've got the opportunity to work with a lot of people on the gospel side of the industry, as well as some of the R&B and pop singers just the same. So that's my thing. I'm a music guy.
Now, I understand you actually were overseas recently.
I was. I was actually doing a club tour.
A club tour?
Don't tell anybody, though.
Yes.
Please don't.
Okay, a club tour. Where at?
My pastor, he's right there.
Yeah, where at?
We toured Japan, Korea, Dubai, the Middle East and Asia, basically.
Okay,
so,
excellent. Yeah. All right, now on my left here, Ozzy, share a little bit about who you are and what your connections to this discussion are.
My name is Oswald, and good to see you guys, by the way. I haven't really infiltrated the music industry. I've done a little bit of the publishing side of things, now entering into radio. I have done a little bit of drama back in the day. That didn't work out too well, but you might hear about that later.
All right. I've been doing some research, and our generation, the conservative numbers say there's 78 million of us, and it goes up from there. Out of that, only 8 million at most showed up at church in the last month. So we're talking a generation that's largely unchurched. And those that are churched, there's a big number of those that see the church as being something that doesn't reflect what they believe is a picture of God. In fact, I was just reading recently 20% of those who attended church as a child no longer attend, and when asked why, they feel that their parents' faith doesn't match with the call of Jesus. Have you ever felt that feeling of that exile, that place where you didn't fit with the belief system or the faith system of mom and dad or the church? And if so, where did you go with it? Are you still struggling with it? Where are you going with it? And I don't care which one of you jumps in first here.
Well, I think we all can say that confidently. As generations progress and they continue to go on, this generation doesn't do things exactly the same way as the one that's going to follow it, and so on and so on. So I think with our generation, I guess were we Generation X, or what did they call we were something. We were looked upon as kind of rebellious, by our parents, and I'm sure we'll do the same thing to our kids. You know what I'm saying? So it's nothing new under the sun. But yeah, I think we've all kind of felt as if we were a bit, outlandish in our Christian views, as we progress in our faith. So.
I do think that the same thing as Terrell's saying. As generations kind of progress, more so, if you ever grown up in the 60s, the 70s, you might be called the hippie generation. But now we're called the rebellious generation. It's just sometimes the generation that comes before, because you don't do things exactly the way they do, it's like you're the rebellious one. But the hippies were rebellious to the generation that came before them. So it's like, what is rebellion? This is just a circle. So it's almost like a circle without a reference.
Okay. So, can you be a rebellious God follower where the church culture of mom and dad may not match yours, and you still be truly a God follower?
I definitely think you kind of have to be a rebel to get extreme results. I think Jesus could have done a lot of things a little bit safer when he was here on earth. He could have done things that kind of matched what everyone would think, would be the practical way to win souls. But he always did something that kind of blew people's mind and made them question, like, is this godliness? Is this righteousness? And he pushed people's minds to that limit. And I feel like ultimately Jesus is, the rebel in the Bible, because he kind of went against what we're supposed to do, as Christians.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
There's actually nothing wrong with rebellion. The question is just what are you rebelling from, and why are you rebelling? Because you have to kind of figure out, once again, that reference. If you're rebelling against God, or if you're rebelling against yourself, or you're rebelling against your mother or your parents, it's like, why are you rebelling? We often kind of get into this rebellion phase in this generation, but there's nothing wrong with rebellion. It's just, what are you rebelling from, and why are you rebelling?
Okay. If you were to create the magic potion to fix what we see as this disconnect between the church and pop culture, what would be part of that fixing this gap?
That's tough. I don't really understand why there is such a huge divide. A lot of times people look at the Christian faith or Christians or young Christians as if it's something totally separate from what's going on in society, and I've seen just the opposite. We are in pop culture whether we want to be or not. If you're waking up in the morning and you're turning on the TV, and you're involved in pop culture by the things that you wear, the places that you go, the way that you talk. We're all influenced by the same culture. So for us to think that we're so special and separate, I think it was a bit funny at times, but I don't think it's it's not something that's impossible to do, to bridge the gap between where we are as Christians and pop culture. There's a practicality that comes along with really having a relationship with God And I think that individually will cause us all to find that medium between holiness, righteousness, being in tune with our spirituality, and also being a part of a world that's going on around us. It's never safe to be in a place and you're the only one that's kind of removed from all the action. I don't think that's what God has kind of called us to do,
All right.
There's nothing wrong with, of course, bridging the gap. There's always the question of how do you bridge the gap? Well, of course, you have to bridge the gap with Christ, but then you run into a problem. What's everybody's perspective of Christ? Well, everybody, okay. So we're going to have different perspectives. The way that many people in our age see Christ is a little bit different than many people above the age of 50. And so the main thing is not mixing together, like being in the world but not of it. There was one thing that I did look up a while back, actually it's like yesterday. And so so that's good, it's fresh. But there is one thing I looked up, and the thing is, among the first deacons that were chosen in the church, there was a guy named Nicholas. And Nicholas he was actually a pagan that switched over to Christianity. And so this is not bad. The apostles thought that he was a man led by the Spirit, and of course they ordained him. You can find this in Acts chapter 6, verse 5. And so this is a very good thing. Except Nicholas was one of the forerunners of the people that began bridging paganism and Christianity together. And it began mixing and mixing and mixing. And so all of a sudden, we've just basically done away with God. We can be a Christian but live as we want. And that's many people's perspective of Christ. Because we come to Christ and we are under the blood now, we don't need to change our lifestyles. And so many people have different perspectives of Christ today. So it's a hard thing to do. Quite honestly, I really think that we need to go back to Scripture. But on essential matters, there should be some type of coherence. But on non-essential matters, we need to stop talking about certain things. I just feel like sometimes in the church, we beat subjects that really aren't salvation issues.
A final thought here for you guys to share that I think probably will be one of the things that will be most important for those in the audience tonight. There's that person out there in the audience tonight that is feeling called by God into pop culture. If we want to call him a missionary, into pop culture. And yet, when they express that to their church family says, you can't do that. You can't go there. That isn't going to work. You're going to just become like them. What can you share with them from your experience, from what you have seen, from what you've experienced, maybe your friends have gone through? What can you tell them? How do they respond to this? They sense God's calling them, but the church says that you couldn't be called that way.
And that's a very, a real problem for a lot of young people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because we see a vision for what we want to do for God and the things that we want to do to advance the kingdom, and sometimes we're scared to do them because we don't know what others in the Christian community will say. And I've had the opportunity, like I said, to work with a lot of people on the gospel side of the industry, and then the secular side. And there's a divide that's made within myself. When you are a Christian, there's certain things that you naturally just don't do. There's certain things you naturally don't say. People can tell there's a difference. A lot of times we've been taught in growing up as a Christian that you had to wear a Fish t-shirt and a WWJD bracelet and put a bumper sticker on your car and totally make this divide from pop culture, and that's never really been effective if we want to be honest about it. I've won more souls by just the way that I treat people, by the way I relay my art. It's never going to be the same as, you know, someone that doesn't have a relationship with Christ, because it's coming from the inside. And when you saturate yourself in a lifestyle of praise and worship, everything else kind of falls in place. And so there's not a conscious divide that you kind of have to make. I would encourage everyone that does see a calling outside of the church to honestly seek God and keep their confidence up, because a lot of times people can kind of beat you down when you don't really have a vision that fits the mold. But I point everyone to look back at Christ and notice that he didn't really do anything with his ministry that fit the mold, and he's the one to match. So
Yeah. Okay.
That's a question. Probably the best thing that I would say is some advice that I'm seeking to take myself. Before you go out and change the world, make sure that you're changed. That's probably the best advice I could give myself or anybody. Because I'll tell you this quickly, that there was a guy that came to a person that I know, a really, really good friend of mine, and he was into Christian rap. And I'm not here to discuss or debate about anything with Christian rap, but I'm just pointing it out to see a point. And so he was into Christian rap. This guy is not really affiliated with these type of things. He has his mindset against it. But he said that he bought this guy's CD. And I was like, really? You of all people? Because he was a huge advocate of not Christian rap and these things. And he said, I did. But I'll tell you this, the only reason that I bought it is because the guy seemed genuine. And if there's anything that is missed, particularly in the church setting, it's genuineness. I don't understand, you know, like, if you can just somehow have the love of Christ in you, then regardless of what industry you're in, whether it's music, whether it's publishing, whether it's television, it doesn't matter whether you're just a person sitting at work on the street doing lawn mowing or something. It really doesn't matter. If you have the love of God in you, then I believe that will completely change your whole perspective in ministry. Just before you try to convert someone, make sure that you're converted. That's about the only thing I would have to say.
Powerful. Make sure you're converted first. Either of you have any last thoughts? I don't want to put you on the spot, but any last thoughts you'd like to share on this topic?
Well, I'm just reminded of the verse that says, greater is he that's within me than he that is in the world. So when I go out and I'm in different places, and when you go out and you're, you know, employed in different places and you're working at different, you know, facets of whatever industry you find yourself in, greater is he that's inside of you than anything else you can come against, anything else that's dividing you, anything else that sets you apart. It's the God in you that gives you the ability to matriculate through any talent, any industry, any, you know, career that you seek. So I just want everyone to remember that. When you keep that strong core, there's nothing you can't come against. So.
Probably one of the last things I'll say is remembering something probably John the Baptist said, that everything that you have comes from above. And it instills humility. When you remember that everything that you have has come from above, and regardless of what you do or industry you might be in, everything will particularly work out for you. It's not particularly about you or getting your career started. You know, it's just take out the you in the situation and remember that religion is not about you, but it's about God. And so if we could all particularly remember that, that's probably the best thing that at least is on my mind.
Yeah. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate you both taking time out of your day to come and share with us. Let's give these two young men a hand for coming up. As promised, we would cover a Bible passage here this evening, and so as we get ready for that, you'll want to get your phone out, because I know that's where your Bible's at. That's our generation, right? And I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 1. And when you turn to Daniel chapter 1, I don't want you to read it right now. I just want you to get there so that we can really actually dig into it here for a few moments, because I discovered something. Daniel isn't the guy I learned about as a little kid. At least not a complete picture of Daniel. You know, do you remember that song? Maybe my parents were just the type of parents that made sure I learned it, but do you remember that song, Dare to be a Daniel? Have you ever thought about what those words actually say? Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose firm. Dare to make it known. Now, I remember those, but I don't remember them in the context of Daniel chapter 1. I remember them in a little different context. And so I think sometimes we run into this problem, because here's what I remember as a kid as the story growing up. This is a shortened, condensed version of that wonderful children's story. If you grew up in the Adventist church, you may have heard, now it may have been a little bit longer than this, but it was basically this story. Daniel arrives in Babylon well-dressed, eating some mysterious foods, and mysteriously and miraculously becomes smart in school. Then God worked some amazing miracles, and Daniel became important in Babylon, and everyone liked him. Then Babylon was defeated, and the new guys that worked under Daniel didn't like him, so they came up with this plan and threw him, well, you know, in the lion's den. Then God, with his super bag of tricks, shut the lions' mouths, so that Daniel could then live a good long life in his home near the palace, and he lived happily ever after. Now, if you go back and look at the children's story, that's about what it says happens. Now, there's also this thing about the type of food and that he prays and all that, but let's be realistic here. Daniel prays 3 times a day at the end of the story. We don't hear about any of the prayer part near as much at the beginning. We focus on that in the children's story at the end. And so I started thinking about, well, who's this Daniel that we sing about, Dare to be a Daniel? Who's this Daniel guy that we talk about, and nothing against diet. So please don't think I'm saying something against diet here, but that we somehow say that this food miraculously fixed everything and he became intelligent because of it. We're young adults. We've all probably went through trying to do the diet thing to make us smart. And probably a lot of us failed miserably at the diet part, and it definitely didn't improve our intelligence much. So when we look at this picture of Daniel in chapter 1, and food does a miracle on him, and all of a sudden he's able to know everything. Well, I started studying up that everything, and I started getting scared. Because I said, that doesn't fit my picture of Daniel or my picture of what God would call any of us to do. And that's why I started saying, what could possibly be a situation, an issue for us in our culture today, where we as a church largely say culture is bad, have our own culture, keep separate, and if you have to come in contact with them, keep your distance. And then we then turn around and say, go into all the world except one place. Pop culture. That's Satan's territory. In fact, I've even had it said to me that anybody who's in that kind of field, well, they've already made their decision. It's kind of a scary place to be, isn't it? If you've already made your decision, yet you don't know the Savior, to make a decision against him. And so I said, this doesn't add up. How could Daniel go to Babylon, have all this happen? He's in a secular culture. How could that be going on? And then today I'm hearing people say, well, we should avoid the culture. And so I'm going to use a phrase here, interrogate reality. I went back to Daniel chapter 1 and started interrogating it for what it actually had to say, not what I thought it said from my children's storybook. And as I began to go into that chapter 1, I realized two things. Daniel had a twofold mission that he was called to do. One was to give hope to a fallen Jewish nation. And the second one was to be a witness to a pagan secular society. Can we relate to that today? A pagan secular society? 78 million millennial Mosaic young adults between the ages of 13 and 30, 35 if we want to expand it a little bit more. And 8 million of them go to church once a month. That's 70 million people in the United States in one age category, one generation, that don't go to church. I think we could call that generation a secular, dare we say, pagan generation. They don't know God. They may have heard about him, but they don't know him. They haven't been given an opportunity to really get to know the Savior and make a true decision. And so, as I looked at that and I realized that God had called Daniel to a secular society, I said, well, how did Daniel fit into that secular pagan society? Now, granted, he didn't go of free will to Babylon. But Isaiah, the prophet, prophesied that Daniel and those with him would go there and work for the king in Babylon. There in Isaiah chapter 39, in verse 7, and some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. A promise, because of the lack of something the Jewish nation wasn't doing, this missing part, God told Isaiah, let the Jewish nation know they're going to Babylon, because they aren't doing something. And so sure enough, we see that happen in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel and his 3 friends are taken to Babylon. And in the process of going to Babylon, we know what happens, right? They end up there. Nebuchadnezzar says, I want the best looking ones. The ones that seem to show the most learning, the most education. I want those. And then he says, and I'm going to send them to Babylonian school. In an article by Tremper Longman called Graduating from Babylonian U, he talks a little bit about what Daniel and his friends were being trained in. Now, we typically think of the great wisdom of Babylon. But here's what they would have been trained in. Reading the stars to tell the future. Pouring oil into water. Reading omens from the livers of sheep. Interpreting dreams. These were the things that Daniel and his friends were being trained in. Not exactly the picture of education that perhaps we think of when we think of our academics today. And so here he is, he's being culturized into the culture of Babylon. He's becoming Babylonian. And it says that God didn't just let him pass, but made him top in his class. In doing what? Reading sheep livers. looking at oil being poured in water and determining based on how it's worked into the, went into the water, determining the future. It says that God gave him all that wisdom and then some more. So much so that he was wiser than anybody else in that class. Where his friends, Jewish young men, who have just defiled themselves completely, what would appear to be a complete rejection of their God, they were called there to do that. For a purpose. Not because they wanted to be like the Babylonians, but for a purpose. Daniel and the other young men were giving God room to work. And I believe there was a reason why they picked the one place they did to stand up to the system. Think about the system for a moment. They had all these awful things in our minds of what they were being trained to do, and the only place they stand up and say time out is on some food? Really? Does that make much sense to you? I'm going to look at a sheep liver and tell you what your problems are? That's okay, but when it comes to this food, I'm not going to eat that? Why would they choose that one item? And again, I'm not attacking our health message here, but it was the one place that it would make no sense for God to intervene and do anything. It's food. I've heard some say, well, it's because it was the meat was offered to idols. Well, in the Babylonian culture, all food was offered to idols. So yes, even the fruits and veggies were being offered to the idols. They had been blessed. So I don't think this is an indication of, well, this shows you what the best diet is, and because of that, that's how come it worked. I think that's when we try to start putting science in place of God. This was a chance for God to show something that made no sense to the Babylonians. They couldn't explain it. How could Daniel and his three friends be so wise when the only thing they're doing different is eating some different food? Oh, and by the way, Daniel didn't always eat fruits and veggies. If you look in Daniel chapter 10, verse 3, when it came to a serious time of prayer, it says that he then stopped eating the king's meat and drinking the king's wine. So this wasn't something that he had just decided he wasn't ever going to consume again. But he used this as an opportunity to let God make a point. And when God makes this point, it's so obvious. You guys are eating different food and you became wise. I can just imagine Nebuchadnezzar standing there grilling these guys going, okay, they're going to mess up at some point. They're Jews. They can't possibly believe this stuff. Why are they even answering these questions? And yet they keep answering one after another, right, correct. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He goes, I'm going to put you guys in charge. Oh, and by the way, I'm putting you in charge of all the wise men in Babylon. All the guys who are going to read the sheep livers, look at the stars, those are going to be the guys that you're going to employ. Those are the guys that are going to come to you to find answers. They're going to come and say, how do I read this sheep liver? It doesn't make sense. That's who Daniel's going to work with for the King Nebuchadnezzar there in Babylon. I think of the children's song, This Little Light of Mine. I'm going to let it shine. All around the neighborhood, I'm going to let it shine. Hide it under a bushel? No. I'm going to let it shine. Let it shine till Jesus comes. even when I'm afraid, I'm going to let it shine. Now, do we really believe that song, or do we just sing it? We tell our little kids, oh, you're going to do this. Sing this. It's what we believe. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, except not all the time. My daughter the other day came to me and she said, Dad, the light in the stairwell's out. Now, she didn't use the word stairwell. She said stairs. The light in the stairs is out. She goes, I can't see. And me, being the smart dad, goes, well, there's plenty of light down here. I can see fine. Well, she didn't think that was a good enough answer. So what if there's enough light in the kitchen? It's easy, isn't it, for us sometimes to say as long as our lights are all together in the same place, it's great. But we don't always want to go out where our light might be the only one shining. Think about Daniel a little bit. He was out there. And often he was the only light shining. And yet he was willing to let it shine. But something happens. You see, because there was a period of time when God had called the Jewish nation to be the light to the world. Way back when they came out of Egypt, even if we go back farther, Abraham was promised that he was going to be a blessing. And we sometimes get lazy with our answer and say, well, that's because he was the promise was Jesus. That's the answer. I don't believe that's the only answer to why God promised to Abraham that he would be a blessing to all the world. You see, he had a bigger picture. He saw the Jewish nation as being a light throughout history, throughout time, being a light to the other nations, and that they would entice and encourage and draw other nations to God because it was so amazing to follow the true God. And yet what happens, we see, is that instead of enticing the other nations, Israel builds walls around their cities and stays inside them and begins to hide God. And then they start being concerned. Uh-oh, the world's coming in. Uh-oh, the enemies are coming. Let's build higher walls. Let's build bigger walls. We'll keep them out. Does that sound familiar at all to any of you? Does that sound like what we fall into sometimes in church? Instead of being the light going out to the world, we end up building walls to protect the church from the world. For Israel, the more they worried about the walls being built, the more they started wanting to be like the people outside the walls. They started asking for a king because, well, we want to be like everybody else. We're tired of trying to protect God that we can't see from the world out there. While God's going, would you go out there and share me with them? Let them see what it's like to follow me. Instead, well, we better protect God from all these awful people out here. And the more they did that, God kept saying, you don't want a king, and yes, we do. So God says, fine, I'll give you a king. Enjoy Saul. He'll drive you crazy. And so then they kept going, well, we want a better king. The next one's going to be better than this one. He'll be more like, and they'd point to another nation. We want to be like them. We want to be like Egypt. We want to be like the Syrians. We want to be like the successful people. And they have God. How much more successful can you get? And yet they said, no, we're going to keep that hidden so people don't know. Instead of people being afraid of Israel, Israel became the joke. Could it be that our generation is the generation that's going to say, instead of building another wall to protect the church from having the world come in, we're going to say, why don't we go to where the world's at and change the world? Change culture. Now, it doesn't happen by getting a bullhorn and yelling at them. How many of you respond to that kind of promotion? Typically, the only time that happens is if you're getting yelled at because something's wrong. And so, we can't just go out and say, hey, I'm just going to scare you into the church. Because the door goes both ways. And you can't build the walls higher because, well, you and I both know the world's already in here. It just takes on different forms. You see, the world, as we describe it sometimes, we're talking about Satan's influence, aren't we? Well, by us not doing anything, sitting, saying it's good enough, we are literally saying, we're okay. We don't need God anymore. We've done our job. And so God is trying to find a group of people who say, my light isn't going to be hidden. I'm going to shine for God in the world. Whether that's at church or, dare we say, in the club Saturday night. It doesn't matter what the location is. Is my light going to shine or not? Am I going to make an impact? Am I going to change the picture? Because my generation, your generation, we're the same generation here. The longer we stay trapped inside our shell, the more we start wanting to be like the world. And we start associating things of the world, of Satan's plan, into our lives. Why? Because, well, there's nothing else. And oftentimes we don't even realize what we're doing because what we're doing seems better than what's happening right now. What would it look like if we were to be Daniels? But before I take you there and you get all excited about being a Daniel, there's some risk involved. Think about what the rest of the Jews in Babylon that were taken into captivity thought about Daniel working for Nebuchadnezzar. What does Daniel think he's doing? He isn't living like a true Hebrew would live. He's worse than the pagan lifestyles of our kings of the past. He just joined Nebuchadnezzar. You know, at least the other guys wanted to be independent. He's working for him. He seems to support Nebuchadnezzar. Think about all the interaction that Daniel has. We see very little discussion at all that Daniel was going and visiting with the other Jews in captivity. We see his interaction in the palace. We see his interaction with the unsaved, if we want to call them that. I don't know about you, but as a pastor, I get frowned at when I don't spend enough time with the church members. Especially if that time is spent with other people and they don't see a quick reaction. Pastor, well, did you get a Bible study started with the person? No. Well, you should go visit so-and-so. They haven't had a pastoral visit lately. Oh, is there something wrong with that? No, but, they're a member here and they should get a visit. Well, I'm working in this group over here. Oh, well, are they Adventists? Well, no, but I want to get to know them and share the gospel with them. Well, are you going to do that soon? Well, I don't know them yet. I don't think it's going to work to just walk over there and say, you need to know Jesus. Do you know him? I said, I've seen how that works. Daniel spends his entire life working for the kings, the high-end officials in a pagan country. And do we see results? Yeah. By the end, who does Nebuchadnezzar worship? The Maker of heaven and earth. Do you think that Daniel was looked at as being a great man by his own nation? No. I highly doubt he was looked at as like, oh, he's our example. You see, the longer Daniel was away from the Jewish people, the less the Jewish people thought he was part of their group. God, though, had to have him there to prepare Nebuchadnezzar for the life change that would have to happen in his life. And if you think he was the only one, I don't believe that at all. I think there were numerous people in that palace over the decades that Daniel worked for Nebuchadnezzar's son and grandson, and then following with the Medes and Persians. Daniel transformed an entire section of pagan history because he was willing to infiltrate, dare we say, the gates of hell, to rescue people from the hold of Satan. See, I believe God is looking for real men and women who aren't just wanting to hang out in church. That's the easy thing to do. Hang out in church. God isn't calling for hangouts. He's not calling for cliques, small group parties, unless they have a purpose to them. See, God's looking for more out of people. He's looking for people who are going to say, I'm going to shine my light no matter whether it's in the grocery store or as the CEO of a company. Whether it's picking up the trash or singing for 10,000 people. Culture is culture. We all live in culture, as was stated earlier. Our choice is, are we going to act like we're in denial that there's a culture around us? Or are we going to accept where we're at and say, okay, God, use me. Let me share who I really am with God transforming my life in front of people. It was stated in the discussion time that our generation doesn't like to see phony people. In fact, I've read some research that says if you want to test a lie detector machine to see if it works, just bring a teenager in. Let them sit next to it and look at the response of the people as the questions are being asked. Because a teenager can pick up a lie, quicker than even the lie detector can. And yet, I was just reading a scary statistic that said that when interviewed, a group of Christians, only 14% of them actually showed signs of actually having an attitude and actions of Christ. 14% of Christians. These are those who said, I'm a Christian, then were asked a series of questions. It was determined that only 14% actually had the actions and attitude of Christ. That's a scary place to be if we want to win the world to Christ, if only 14% of those going around saying, I'm a Christian, actually live it and have an attitude of Christ. What is it going to take for us to say, my four walls are going to be gone? I'm looking outside to find who I can shine my light with. You see, because my daughter was right. My kitchen, it had lots of light bulbs that worked really well. My stairwell didn't have any. So what that meant is we got to trip and fall up and down the stairs until I decided to put a new light bulb in the stairwell. God's waiting for some new light bulbs to be put in to some places that we have said, well, it's okay if they just stay dark. God isn't okay with that. He put Daniel in a place where it doesn't make sense. Daniel went through things that don't make sense for the purpose of sharing the gospel to a group of people who didn't know. I believe there's somebody here tonight who's in that same position. God's calling them. He's calling one of you to that spot. Now, I don't know what that spot is. You might not even know. Do you think Daniel had it planned out? I'm going to Babylon? No. But he said, I'm willing to go. And I'm going to let my light shine. And through letting our light shine, I can dare to be like Daniel and share a gospel message of love, of hope, of acceptance in a culture that has none of that. You realize how much we make fun of people through our pop culture? That's all we do now. That's the way we make money. Just turn on any television show and the goal of it is to make fun of somebody. Tear somebody down to build yourself up. That means there's a whole lot of people who need to hear some hope because they've been torn down for a long time. God's called us to do that. Our music industry, I don't care what type of music it is, typically is tearing down one sex or the other. It's building up one gender and tearing down the other. It's building up one type of culture and tearing down another. That's the way we make money these days, right? What if we were to step in there and say, we've got a message of hope for you, even if it has been tearing you down? Our culture needs us, but it can't use us if we don't join it and become part of it and infiltrate it with the gospel. I'm going to shine my light. Maybe not in popular places, but I'm going to shine it. Are you willing to join me in shining it? Will you stand with me? Father God, you've promised to keep our light shining as long as we stay connected to you. And yet, we think that we have to stay somehow hidden somewhere so often that to keep our lights working, we just got to stay where we're at. We want to take you up on your promise to be with us and walk with us and go with us, and that you're actually not just going to walk beside us, but you're willing to lead us in all things. If there's someone here tonight that needs to take that step of faith to shine their light in a place that they've been afraid to, give them courage. Give them strength. Give them power to take that light and shine it. Maybe there's some of us we've wandered a little bit off the path and our light almost feels like it's going out. Take us back to your word. Help us to interrogate that reality of what you've done and how you used so many people throughout history that's been recorded for us. Help us to see how you'll carry us back into the light. And that then you will use us in amazing ways. Forgive us, Father, where we maybe haven't exactly had the light shining. Where we maybe have hidden our lights, kept them closed up at church, or maybe we aren't even going to church anymore, and we We don't feel like we have a part anymore. Help us to see that that isn't your plan for us. But may we be willing to share our light that others may see us, especially in the world around us, in the culture we live in, this new era perhaps for us where, God, you aren't the center of most people's thinking anymore. Give us the courage to shine our lights. In Jesus' name, amen.